There is nowhere you need to be tonight except here, drifting somewhere between waking and sleep, while an old story unfolds around you. Tonight, we go back, not to the beginning of history, but to the beginning of everything, to a time before time had a name, before the sun had risen even once, before there was a sky to rise into. The old Greeks had a word for what existed before existence. They called it chaos. Not chaos the way we use the word now, not disorder, not noise. Chaos, in the oldest telling, was simply a vast and yawning emptiness, a gap, a silence with no edges. Imagine the deepest, softest darkness you have ever known. Not frightening, just endless. And you begin to understand chaos. It was not empty of possibility. It was full of everything that had not yet decided to become anything. And slowly, the way a single thought rises out of a dreamless sleep, something stirred within that darkness. From chaos came Gaia, the earth herself, wide and dark and patient. She did not appear all at once, the way a light switches on. She settled into being the way morning settles over a hillside, gradually, so gently, that no one could say exactly when night had ended. From chaos, too, came Tartarus, a deep and hollow place beneath even the earth, a chasm so distant that if you dropped a stone from the surface of the world, it would fall for 9 long days and 9 long nights before ever reaching the bottom. Try to imagine that kind of depth. Let your mind sink toward it slowly, the way the stone might have. And from chaos came Eros, not a person yet, not quite, but a force. The pull that draws one thing toward another. The reason atoms cling and rivers run toward the sea, and hearts much later would ache toward other hearts. Even in that first darkness, something in the universe already wanted to be close to something else. Gaia, alone in the dark, breathed the world into shape around her. She brought forth Uranus, the starry sky, to cover her and hold her, the way a blanket holds a sleeping body. She raised the mountains from her own shoulders, slow and heavy, the way you might shift in your sleep without waking. She poured out the sea, Pontus, salt and deep and endlessly rocking, and it lay against her like a long, slow breath. The sky and the earth and the sea. That was the first world. No people yet, no animals, no birdsong, only the enormous, patient hush of the universe settling into its own shape. And in that hush, we will let our own breathing settle too. Let your shoulders soften into whatever is beneath you. Let your jaw unclench. There is a very old story ahead of us, long and winding, and there is no need to hurry through any of it. We have all the hours of the night. Uranus and Gaia, the sky and the earth joined together, and from that joining came the very first children the universe had ever known. The children of sky and earth were strange and enormous, because the world itself was still strange and enormous, still finding its proportions, the way a room looks huge to a small child and shrinks slowly as the years pass. First came the Titans, 12 of them, 6 sons and 6 daughters, tall as mountains, old as the first light. Their names moved like a low, slow tide, Oceanus and Tethys, who would hold the waters of the world between them, Hyperion and Thea, who carried light itself and would one day become the parents of the sun and moon and dawn, Cronus, the youngest, and, in time, the most consequential, Rhea, gentle and enduring. Iapetus, Crius, Coeus, Phoebe, Mnemosyne, memory itself, given form, so that even in that first age, the universe was already learning to remember. Say their names slowly in your mind, if you like. There is no need to hold on to all of them. Let them pass through you the way clouds pass over a hill, leaving only a soft shadow behind. After the Titans came other children, stranger still. 3 Cyclopes, each with a single round eye in the center of his forehead, forgers of great strength, who would, ages later, become the smiths of thunder itself. And after them, 3 more children so vast and strange that Uranus, their own father, could not bear to look at them. The Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones, each with 50 heads and 100 powerful arms, beings of raw, overwhelming force. And here the story grows heavier for a moment, the way a story sometimes must before it can grow lighter again. Uranus, afraid of these last children, of their strength and their strangeness, pushed them back down into the darkness of their mother, down into the hidden hollow of Gaia's body, and would not let them rise into the light. Gaia bore this pain the way the earth bears all things, quietly, for a long, long time. But even patience has an end. She gathered her Titan children around her and asked, gently but seriously, which of them would help her set things right. Only one answered. Cronus, the youngest, the most cautious and the most ambitious all at once, stepped forward from the shadows of that first world and said that he would. We won't dwell long on what happened next, only enough to understand how the world changed hands. Gaia gave Cronus a great curved blade, sharp as starlight, and when Uranus came again to lie with the earth as he always had, Cronus rose from hiding and ended his father's reign. It was a violent turning, yes, the first violence the young universe had ever known, but out of it came something new, separation. The sky lifted away from the earth for the first time. Space opened between them. Light had room to move. Air had room to breathe. And in that new space, gods that had not existed before came into being. Among them, Aphrodite, born from the sea foam where Uranus's power had fallen into the waves, rising up pale and lovely and calm, drifting toward the shore the way a leaf drifts down a quiet stream. The old order had ended. The new one, ruled now by the Titans with Cronus at its head, had begun. Let your body settle a little further down. This part of the story, the turning of one age into another, will happen more than once tonight. Each time, you can let it wash over you like a wave rolling gently up a shore and pulling back out again. Nothing to hold on to, only the sound of it. For a long while, the world was calm. They called this time the Golden Age, and it deserved the name. Under Cronus and his queen Rhea, the earth gave freely, without demanding labor in return. Rivers ran clear. The seasons had not yet learned to argue with one another. No harsh winter, no scorching drought, only a long, mild, endless kind of spring. If people had existed yet in great numbers, they would have needed no locks on their doors, no walls around their fields. But that is a story for later. when mortals finally take their place in this telling. For now, understand only this: it was a peaceful age, golden and slow, much like the pace of the story you are hearing right now. But peace in these old stories rarely lasts, because even gods carry old fears with them. Cronus had not forgotten how he came to power. He remembered, with a coldness that never quite left him, that he had risen by overthrowing his own father. And a terrible thought took root in him, the way a single dark cloud can take root on the edge of an otherwise clear sky. That one of his own children might rise to do the same to him. So when Rhea began to bear children, Hestia first, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon, Cronus did something almost too sorrowful to say gently, and yet the old story insists on saying it. As each child was born, he swallowed them, one after another, down into the darkness of himself, believing that if they were never free, they could never challenge him. Rhea bore this the way Gaia had once borne her own grief, quietly, for a long time, though grief like that does not stay quiet forever. When she was due to bear her sixth child, Rhea went to her own mother, Gaia, for counsel, the way any of us might go looking for our mothers when a burden becomes too heavy to carry alone. Gaia listened, and together they made a plan. When the child was born, a son, whom Rhea named Zeus, she did not bring him to Cronus at all. Instead, she wrapped a large stone in soft swaddling cloth, the way you might wrap a stone to look, from a distance, very much like a sleeping infant. She carried this bundle to Cronus, and Cronus, without looking too closely, swallowed the stone, believing it to be his son. And the true child, the real Zeus, was carried far away to a quiet cave on the island of Crete, on the slopes of a mountain where the air was cool and the world was hidden and safe. There, nymphs cared for him. A goat named Amalthea gave him her milk, and when he cried, as infants do, attendants clashed their shields together outside the cave so that the sound of his crying would be lost beneath the ringing of bronze, and Cronus, far away, would never hear it. So the youngest god of the new generation grew up in secret, in the hush of a mountain cave, rocked by a soft and ancient darkness, much like the darkness you might be resting in right now. Let that image settle over you for a moment. A hidden cave, a sleeping child, the whole future of the world curled up quietly, waiting, unhurried, while somewhere far away, an old king believed himself safe. Zeus grew slowly, the way all things in this story seem to grow. Unhurried, patient, gathering strength quietly before ever stepping into the light. When he was fully grown, he did not rush toward vengeance. He moved carefully. With the help of Metis, a titaness known for her clear and careful wisdom, he found a way to give Cronus a draught that made him release everything he had swallowed all those years before. One by one, Zeus's brothers and sisters came back into the light of the world. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. Each of them older in years than Zeus, and yet, having spent all that time hidden away, somehow newer to the world than he was. It is a strange thing to picture, if you let yourself picture it slowly. Siblings returning to daylight together, blinking, uncertain, finding their footing in a world they had never truly seen. Together, these 6 gods, the ones who would come to be called the Olympians, faced the Titans in a war that the old poets called the Titanomachy. It lasted 10 long years. Mountains were said to have been thrown like stones. The earth shook the way it does deep in a dream, when something enormous moves just beneath the surface of things. I won't linger on the details of the fighting. It is not the kind of thing that belongs in a story meant to carry you towards sleep. What matters is the shape of it. That Zeus freed the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones from the depths where Uranus had once hidden them away, and in gratitude the Cyclopes forged great gifts. A thunderbolt for Zeus, sharp and world-splitting, a trident for Poseidon that could call up the sea or still it, and a helm of invisible darkness for Hades, so quiet and complete that even the gods could not see him wearing it. With these gifts and the strength of the freed 100-handed ones beside them, the young gods finally overcame the Titans. Cronus and most of his generation were bound and sent down to Tartarus, that same deep, distant place we spoke of at the very beginning of tonight's story. 9 days fall beneath the world, where they would remain, no longer ruling, no longer feared, only remembered. The old age had ended. A new one had begun. And here is the part of the story that has always felt, to me, strangely tender. 3 brothers standing at the edge of a transformed world, deciding quietly among themselves how to divide it. Not with more war, not with more thunder. They simply drew lots, the way children might draw straws to decide who goes first in a game. Zeus drew the sky, and so he became ruler of the heavens, keeper of the thunder, and in time, king over gods and mortals alike. Poseidon drew the sea and descended into its blue and endless rooms, where he would rule the waves and the creatures beneath them. Hades drew the underworld, the quiet realm beneath the earth, and there he settled, not as a villain, though later stories would sometimes paint him that way, but as a keeper, patient, fair, unmoving, the quiet caretaker of all who came to rest in his halls. And the earth and the sky above it, they agreed to hold in common, belonging to no single one of them, but to all. Rest for a moment here, if you like. The Great War is over. The world has been divided gently, almost kindly among tired brothers. Somewhere above you, if you can imagine it, the very first true daylight of this new age is only just beginning to rise. High above the world, farther up than any mortal foot would ever comfortably climb, there is a mountain called Olympus, its peak wrapped always in soft cloud, its air thin and golden and very, very quiet. This is where the gods made their home, and this is where, slowly, over a long stretch of time, 12 of them came to be honored above all the rest. Let them arrive in your mind now, unhurried, one at a time, the way guests might arrive to a long, quiet dinner, each pausing at the door before finding their seat. Zeus came first, of course, as he always did, king of the gods, lord of the sky, keeper of the thunderbolt. He was not simply strength, though he had plenty of it. He was also order. Oaths were sworn in his name because he was the one who made sure the world kept its promises to itself. The sunrise following the sunset, the seasons following their turns. Beside him sat Hera, his queen, goddess of marriage and of the home, dignified and watchful, fiercely loyal to the bonds that held families together, even when her own family, the family of gods, tested her patience again and again. Poseidon, brother of Zeus, came up only rarely from his blue and rolling halls beneath the sea. But when he did, the whole mountain seemed to hum faintly, as though remembering the sound of distant waves. He was the earth shaker too, not only lord of the ocean, but of every tremor that ever passed beneath the ground. Demeter, sister to them both, carried the quiet, patient power of the harvest. Wherever she walked, wheat bent low as if bowing. She was the reason fields turned gold in late summer, and, as we'll hear a little later tonight, the reason the year itself learned to have seasons at all. Athena arrived differently than the rest, born not from a mother in the usual sense, but from the mind of Zeus himself, said to have sprung forth fully grown and fully armoured, calm-eyed and clear-headed, goddess of wisdom and of thoughtful, careful strategy. Where Ares represented the chaos of war, Athena represented its discipline, not violence for its own sake, but the steady mind that knows when and whether to fight at all. Apollo, golden and radiant, was god of the sun's light in its gentler sense, of music, of prophecy, of healing. When he played his lyre, it was said the whole mountain would fall into a kind of hush, the way this room around you might be falling into a hush right now. Artemis, his twin sister, moved through wild forests and quiet moonlit clearings, goddess of the hunt, protector of animals and of young things everywhere, swift and silver and calm. Ares carried the roar and heat of war itself, impulsive, restless, more feared than loved, though even he had his place in the great balance of the mountain. Aphrodite, whom we met briefly rising from the sea foam, was goddess of love and beauty, and wherever she walked, it was said the grass grew softer beneath her feet. Hephaestus, god of the forge, worked with fire and metal in halls filled with the steady rhythm of hammer on iron, crafting wonders for gods and mortals alike. His hands, though scarred by his labor, capable of the most delicate beauty. Hermes, quick and clever, winged sandals on his feet, was messenger of the gods, guide of travelers, and, depending on who told the story, a bit of a trickster besides, always moving, always just one step ahead. And Dionysus, youngest to join their company, god of wine and festivity and the wilder, freer parts of life, brought a different kind of energy to the mountain, loosened, joyful, unafraid of letting go. 12 gods, each different, each necessary, the way 12 different notes might be necessary to complete a single, long, slow piece of music. You do not need to remember all of them. Let their names drift, the way names sometimes drift through your mind just before sleep, half-formed, softening at the edges. There will be time enough throughout tonight's story to meet several of them again, more closely, through the mortals whose lives they touched. For now, only picture the mountain itself, high, quiet, wrapped in soft white cloud, 12 seats around a long table, an eternal evening settling gently over all of them. Below them, the wider family of gods and spirits stretched out across the whole of the world, quieter figures who rarely sat at that long table, but who shaped ordinary life all the same. Hestia, eldest of the Olympian siblings, kept the sacred hearthfire always burning, gentle and unassuming, present in every home's own quiet fireplace. Pan wandered the wild hills, playing his reed pipes among the goats and shepherds. The Muses, 9 sisters, inspired poetry and music and the careful record of history. The Fates, 3 quiet, unhurried sisters, spun, measured, and cut the thread of every mortal life, working always together, never rushing their patient craft. And the Graces, 3 more sisters, moved gently through the world, spreading charm, beauty, and warmth wherever they passed. You don't need to hold all of them either. Let this whole wide family simply exist somewhere behind the story now, felt rather than counted, the way you might sense a whole house full of quietly sleeping people around you without needing to picture each one individually. Before we go further among gods, let's turn toward the mortals. Because it was around this time, the old stories say, that human beings first came to exist upon the earth. They were shaped, some versions say, by a titan named Prometheus, whose name means, roughly, forethought, the one who thinks ahead. He is remembered as clever and quietly compassionate, more thoughtful than many of the gods around him, and fonder of humankind than most of Olympus ever quite understood. In the earliest days, mortals lived a hard, cold, dim sort of life. They had no fire. Without fire, there was no warmth in winter, no cooked food, no metalworking, none of the small comforts that make a life feel less like survival and more like living. Prometheus watched this and felt, the stories say, something like sorrow. Zeus had forbidden fire to be given to mortals, perhaps out of caution, perhaps out of the same old fear that had once haunted Cronus, the fear of what those below might become if given too much too soon. But Prometheus, moved by something gentler than obedience, took a hollow stalk of fennel, touched it to the eternal flame that burned on Olympus, and carried a single glowing ember down the long slope of the mountain, hidden inside the stalk, all the way to the waiting world below. Picture that image slowly, if you like. A small ember, cupped and hidden, carried a very long way in the dark, toward people who did not yet know it was coming. Mortals learned to build fires. They learned to cook, to forge, to light the night. Their lives grew warmer in every sense of the word. Zeus, discovering what had been done, was not pleased. Prometheus was bound to a high rocky cliff as punishment, where, in the harsher versions of the tale, an eagle would come each day to peck at him, a suffering that renewed itself endlessly. We won't dwell in that harshness tonight. It is enough to know that Prometheus bore a heavy price for his kindness, and that even the gods in this old telling understood consequence and cost. But Zeus was not finished. If mortals were to have fire, he decided, they would also come to know difficulty in equal measure. He asked Hephaestus, the god of the forge, to create a woman from clay, more beautiful than anything mortal eyes had yet seen. The gods each gave her a gift: grace from Aphrodite, skill from Athena, and, from Hermes, a curious, restless kind of curiosity. They called her Pandora, which means, roughly, all gifted. Pandora was given among her possessions a great sealed jar. Later storytellers would call it a box, though the oldest tellings say jar, and she was told, quite clearly, never to open it. You already know, I think, the shape this story is about to take. It is one of the oldest shapes a story can take. A door that should not be opened, and a hand that, sooner or later, reaches for it anyway. One quiet afternoon, alone with her curiosity, Pandora lifted the lid. Out into the world flew every hardship that had not existed before. Sickness, sorrow, envy, old age, hard labor, and all the smaller griefs that have followed humankind ever since. Pandora, startled, closed the lid quickly, but it was already too late. All of it had escaped into the wide world, except for one thing. At the very bottom of the jar, one small winged spirit remained, having not yet had the chance to fly free. Its name was Elpis, Hope. And so, the old story tells us, Hope remained behind, tucked quietly inside the same vessel that had released every hardship. Not separate from our troubles, but folded in close beside them, always within reach if we know where to look. Let that thought settle over you gently before we move on. Whatever hardship this old jar released into the world, hope was packed in right alongside it and never quite left. Time moved on, the way it always does, even in stories as old as this one. Zeus, looking down upon humankind some generations later, found much of it corrupted and cruel, and decided, in a story that echoes curiously in many cultures around the world, to wash it away and begin again. He sent a great flood across the earth, rains that did not stop, rivers that forgot their banks. But Prometheus, still watching over mortals despite his own long punishment, warned his son Deucalion of what was coming. Deucalion and his wife Hera built a great chest, sturdy and sealed, and floated upon the rising waters for 9 days and 9 nights, until at last the rain stopped and the waters began, slowly to recede, leaving them alone upon a quiet, freshly washed world. Wanting to know how to begin again, they consulted an oracle and were told, strangely, to throw the bones of their mother behind them as they walked. Puzzled at first, they came to understand the riddle. Their mother, in the broadest sense, was the earth herself, and her bones were her stones. So they walked forward, casting stones over their shoulders, and each stone that Deucalion threw became a man, and each stone that Hera threw became a woman. And in this slow, strange, quiet way, humankind began again. There is something worth resting on there, if you'd like to rest on it. A world ending gently in water and beginning again in stone, unhurried, patient, the way the earth always seems to find its way back to fullness, no matter how empty it has been. From this new beginning, the story turns toward one of the gentlest and saddest tales in the whole telling, the story of Demeter and her daughter. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, had a daughter named Persephone, bright and young, who loved to wander through meadows gathering flowers. One quiet day, while Persephone bent to pick a particularly beautiful flower, some say a narcissus, planted there in the darker versions of the tale as a kind of trap. The earth split suddenly open beneath her, and Hades, lord of the underworld, rose up in his dark chariot and carried her down into his quiet realm to be his queen. Demeter searched for her daughter across the whole world, and finding no trace of her, fell into a grief so deep that the harvest itself began to fail. Fields that had once bent gold with wheat lay bare and grey. Trees stood bare out of season. The world, following its grieving goddess, began to starve. At last, Zeus intervened and arranged for Persephone to be returned to her mother. But there was a complication. While in the underworld, Persephone had eaten a few seeds of pomegranate, and this bound her in some small but permanent way to that quiet realm below. A compromise was reached, gentle as these old compromises often are. Persephone would spend part of each year below with Hades and part of each year above with her mother. And so, the old story tells us, when Persephone descends each year into the underworld, Demeter's grief settles over the world like a long, slow evening, and the fields grow bare, and the trees let go of their leaves. This is winter. And when Persephone rises again each year to be with her mother, Demeter's joy spreads warmth back across the land, and the fields bloom again. This is spring. If you are lying somewhere warm right now, imagine it as one of Demeter's warmer months. If it is cold outside your window, imagine this is one of the quiet months when her daughter is below, and the world simply waits, patiently, for her return. Either way, the story reminds us gently, winter always ends. The daughter always comes back up into the light. There is a smaller story that belongs somewhere near here, quiet and sorrowful, about a nymph named Echo and a young man named Narcissus. And it is worth telling slowly, the way small sad stories deserve to be told. Echo was a nymph of the mountains, fond of talk, fond of the last word in any conversation. Hera, suspecting Echo of distracting her with idle chatter while Zeus wandered off to see one nymph or another, placed upon her a quiet, heavy curse. Echo could no longer speak first. She could only repeat the final words that others said to her. One day, wandering the same forest, Echo saw a young man of extraordinary beauty, named Narcissus, hunting alone among the trees, and she loved him instantly and completely, the way you sometimes fall softly towards sleep without quite meaning to. But cursed as she was, she could not call out to him, could not tell him how she felt. She could only wait hidden among the trees until he spoke first. At last he called out, hearing rustling in the leaves, "Is anyone here?" And Echo, with all the longing she could not otherwise express, answered only, "Here, here." Narcissus, confused and eventually unmoved by a voice with no visible speaker, turned away from her, and Echo, heartbroken, retreated deeper and deeper into the mountains, until, the old story tells us gently, she faded slowly away into nothing but her voice, the faint, repeating sound you still sometimes hear bouncing back to you across a quiet valley. Narcissus, in turn, wandered on until he came to a still, clear pool of water and bent down to drink. There, for the first time, he saw his own reflection and was struck by its beauty so completely that he could not look away. He stayed by that pool, gazing down at himself, unable to leave, unable to eat or rest, until, slowly, the way a flower closes at evening, he faded there too, and in his place grew a pale, quiet flower that still carries his name. It is a sad little story, yes, but there is something gentle hidden in it too, if you look closely. a reminder that love needs to travel in more than one direction to survive, out towards someone else, not only inward, toward the reflection of oneself. Let it settle quietly, the way the pool must have settled once Narcissus was gone, smooth again, undisturbed, holding nothing but sky. Now the story turns toward heroes, mortal men and women who, through courage or cleverness or the quiet help of a watching god, did things that outlasted their own short lives by thousands of years. The first among them tonight is Perseus. He was born to a princess named Danae, who had been locked away in a bronze chamber by her own father, a king who had been warned by an oracle that his daughter's son would one day be the cause of his death. But Zeus, as Zeus often did in these old stories, found his way to her anyway, appearing as a shower of soft golden light, and from this union Perseus was born. Frightened, the king set mother and infant adrift on the sea in a wooden chest, trusting the waves to decide their fate rather than doing the deed himself. But the sea was gentler than the king had hoped, and the chest washed ashore safely on a distant island, where a kind fisherman took them in and raised the boy as his own. Perseus grew tall and capable, and in time a cruel local king, wanting Perseus out of the way so that he might pursue Danae freely, sent the young man on what he believed to be an impossible task to bring back the head of Medusa. Medusa was one of 3 sisters known as the Gorgons, but unlike her sisters, she had once been mortal. A woman, the stories say, whose great beauty caught the eye of Poseidon, and whose fate afterward was decided cruelly by Athena, who transformed her hair into writhing serpents and cursed her gaze so that anyone who looked directly upon her face would turn instantly to stone. This part of the story could be frightening if told quickly, so let's tell it slowly instead, the way you might walk carefully through a dim, quiet room rather than rush through it. Perseus did not go alone, not truly. The gods, taking pity on him, gave him gifts, winged sandals from Hermes to carry him swiftly through the air, a polished shield from Athena, so reflective it could serve as a mirror, a curved blade sharp enough for the task ahead, and a cap of invisibility, borrowed, some say, from Hades himself. Perseus flew to the edge of the world, where the Gorgons slept in a cave surrounded by the stone shapes of those unlucky enough to have looked at Medusa before him. Rather than looking directly at her, he used Athena's polished shield as a mirror, watching her reflection instead of her face. And in this careful, clever way, he struck true, ending her curse in a single motion. From the moment of her death, 2 beings sprang forth from her, a winged horse named Pegasus, pure white and swift, and a warrior named Chrysaor. Even in an old, sad story, something beautiful can rise unexpectedly from an ending. Perseus carried Medusa's head home in a pouch, using its power once or twice more along his journey, to rescue a princess named Andromeda from a sea monster, turning the beast to stone, and later to deal finally with the king who had sent him on this impossible errand in the first place. In time, Perseus gave Medusa's head to Athena, who set it upon her own shield, where it remained forever after, a quiet reminder of an old sorrow turned eventually into protection. Let your breathing settle again here. The frightening parts of these old stories are always brief, and they are always, eventually, followed by calm. There is a quieter story that belongs near this one, about a young woman named Arachne, gifted beyond measure at weaving, so skilled that people said quietly among themselves that surely even Athena herself could not weave more beautifully. Word of this reached Athena, as such words tend to reach the gods, and she came down disguised as an old woman, offering Arachne a gentle warning. Talent is a gift worth honoring humbly, not boasting of too loudly. Arachne, proud and unwilling to soften her claim, insisted she would weave against the goddess herself and prove her equal. Athena, dropping her disguise, accepted the challenge, and the two wove side by side in a contest that the old poets describe with quiet awe. Athena's tapestry depicting the dignity and order of the gods, Arachne's depicting their occasional missteps and follies, woven with undeniable, flawless skill. There was no fault to find in Arachne's work, and this, in its own way, was the trouble. Athena, moved by something between admiration and offense, transformed the girl gently into a spider, so that she might go on weaving forever, small and quiet, in the corners of the world, no longer boasting, simply creating, thread by thread, the way she always did best. If you notice a spider's web somewhere tonight, in a corner of a ceiling, or strung quietly between two branches, let it remind you gently of Arachne, still weaving, patient and endless, long after the contest that made her small. Few names echo through these old stories as loudly as Heracles, though you may know him by his later Roman name, Hercules. He was, like Perseus, a son of Zeus, born to a mortal woman named Alcmene, and from his very first days he was extraordinary in strength. Hera, Zeus's queen, who resented these mortal children of her husband, sent two serpents into his cradle to end him before he had truly begun. The infant Heracles, the old story tells us, simply reached out with each hand and strangled them both, laughing as though it had been a game. He grew into the strongest mortal the world had ever known, but his life was shadowed by tragedy as well as strength. In a fit of madness sent upon him by Hera, he lost those closest to him, and in his grief and guilt afterward, he sought a way to make amends. He was sent to serve a king named Eurystheus, who set him 12 seemingly impossible labors. We will move through them slowly, the way you might move through the rooms of a very old house at night, only glancing into each one before moving gently to the next. First, he was sent to slay the Nemean lion, a beast whose hide could not be pierced by any blade. Heracles wrestled it with his bare hands instead, and afterward wore its impenetrable skin as his own armor. Second, the many-headed Hydra, whose heads grew back 2 for every one that was cut away. Heracles, with the help of his nephew, learned to cauterize each wound the moment a head fell, so that no new ones could rise. Third, the Ceryneian hind, a deer so swift that Heracles pursued it for a full year before finally catching it, unharmed, exactly as he had been instructed. Fourth, the Erymanthian boar, driven from its lair and captured alive. Fifth, the stables of King Augeas, filled with the waste of 1,000 cattle, uncleaned for years. Heracles, cleverly, diverted 2 rivers to wash them clean in a single day. Sixth, the Stymphalian birds, with beaks and feathers sharp as metal, driven off with the help of a bronze rattle given to him by Athena. 7th, the Cretan bull, wild and fire-breathing, captured and carried alive across the sea. 8th, the mares of Diomedes, wild horses fed on human flesh, tamed at last and brought back peacefully. 9th, the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, obtained in most tellings not through battle at all, but through a conversation, since Hippolyta was willing to give it freely. A small, quiet reminder that not every labor needed to end in a fight. 10th, the cattle of the monster Geryon herded across great distances back to Greece. 11th, the golden apples of the Hesperides, guarded by nymphs at the far edge of the world, retrieved in one version with the clever help of the Titan Atlas, who briefly handed the weight of the sky to Heracles' shoulders while he went to fetch the apples himself. And 12th, the final and heaviest labor, to descend into the underworld itself and bring back Cerberus, the three-headed hound who guarded its gates, and then, having proven it could be done, return him safely to where he belonged. Heracles completed each of these labors, one after another, patiently, the way a very long task is finished, not by rushing, but by returning to it again and again until it is done. And in completing them, he earned not only his freedom from guilt, but a kind of honor that outlasted his own lifetime, eventually joining the gods themselves on Olympus after his mortal life came to its end. There is one more small piece to this story, tucked quietly into the 11th labor, worth returning to now, because it reaches all the way back to the very start of our night together. On his way to the garden of the golden apples, Heracles passed by the very cliff where Prometheus still hung bound. All those long ages after his kindness to humankind had first angered Zeus. Moved by the old Titan's endless suffering, Heracles paused in his labor, freed Prometheus from his chains at last, and ended a punishment that had stretched on for more generations than anyone could easily count. It feels right somehow that the same strength which endured 12 impossible labors would also be the strength that finally closed the oldest debt in tonight's whole story. The debt owed to the one who first carried a small ember of fire down a long mountain slope, out of simple kindness, so very long ago. If you are still awake, notice how heavy your body has grown by now, the way Atlas's shoulders must have grown heavy beneath the weight of the sky. It's all right to let that heaviness settle. There is no task waiting for you tonight, except rest. There is one more story worth pausing on here, gentle and sorrowful, about a musician named Orpheus, whose songs were said to be so beautiful that rivers paused in their courses to listen, and even stones were known to soften at the sound. Orpheus loved a woman named Eurydice, and on the very day of their wedding, tragedy found her. A serpent hidden in the grass, and a bite that ended her life before the celebration had even finished. Orpheus's grief was enormous, the kind of grief that does not simply settle with time, and rather than accept it, he made a decision that no mortal before him had dared to make. He would go down himself into the underworld and ask for her back. He walked the long, quiet path down to the halls of Hades, playing his lyre the entire way, and even the fearsome guardians of that realm, Cerberus, the ferryman Charon, the judges of the dead, paused their duties to listen, moved despite themselves by the sound of his sorrow made into music. Hades and Persephone, hearing him play, were moved as well, and agreed to release Eurydice back to the world above, on a single, careful condition. Orpheus must walk ahead of her the entire way back to the surface, and must not look behind him until they had both fully returned to the light. It is one of the hardest instructions any story has ever given a person. To trust, without seeing, that someone you love is following safely behind you. Orpheus walked the long path upward, listening for footsteps he could not quite be sure he heard. Doubt growing heavier with every step, the way doubt tends to grow heavier the longer it goes unanswered. And just as he reached the very edge of the upper world, so close that sunlight had already touched his own face, his doubt overcame him, and he turned to look. Eurydice was there, just a step behind him, but not close enough. The condition had not yet been fully met, and she was pulled gently, sorrowfully, back down into the dark, this time for good. It is a sad ending, and I won't try to soften it more than it deserves. But even sad stories have their own kind of steadiness, and this one has endured for thousands of years, precisely because it understands something true, that grief can move even the most unmovable things, and that love, even when it fails to bring someone all the way home, is rarely wasted in the trying. On the island of Crete, there lived a king named Minos, and beneath his palace, in a maze so intricate that no one who entered it could ever find their own way back out, there lived a creature called the Minotaur, half man, half bull, born of a strange and sorrowful history involving Minos's own wife. Every 9 years, Athens was required to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete, to be given to the labyrinth, never to return. A young prince of Athens named Theseus, hearing of this cruel tribute, volunteered to go among them, determined to end it. Upon arriving in Crete, he caught the attention of Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, who found herself, almost without meaning to, falling for the brave young stranger. Wanting to help him survive what seemed an impossible task, she gave him a simple gift, a ball of thread. Theseus tied one end at the entrance of the labyrinth and unwound it slowly behind him as he moved deeper and deeper into the maze, deeper into its dim, winding stone corridors, the walls narrowing and turning, the way a story sometimes winds and turns just before its ending. At the center, he found the Minotaur, and after a difficult struggle, he ended the creature's long, sorrowful existence. Then, simply by following the thread back the way he had come, he found his way out again, safe and unharmed, into the daylight above. There is something quietly comforting in that image, I think, that even in the deepest, darkest, most confusing maze, a single thin thread, if you hold onto it patiently, can lead you all the way back out again. The story that follows is a sadder one. Theseus, in his hurry to sail home, forgot to change his ship's black sails for white ones, a signal he had promised his father he would raise if he survived. Seeing black sails still on the horizon, his father, believing his son had died, threw himself into the sea in grief, a sea which has carried his name, the Aegean, ever since. We will let that sadness pass through gently the way sadness sometimes needs to, without lingering too long upon it. Theseus went on to become a great king of Athens himself, remembered for uniting the scattered towns of the region into a single city. Patient and lasting work that outlived even his most famous adventure. There is one more tale of flight and folly worth telling here, small and quick and quiet, about a craftsman named Daedalus, the very same man, in fact, who had designed that winding labyrinth on Crete. King Minos, unwilling to let the man who knew the labyrinth's secrets leave the island freely, kept Daedalus and his young son Icarus imprisoned in a high tower. Daedalus, clever as ever, devised a way out that no wall or guard could prevent. Wings, built carefully from feathers and wax, one pair for himself and one smaller pair for his son. Before they flew, Daedalus gave Icarus a single quiet warning: fly neither too low, where the sea's damp air might weigh the feathers down, nor too high, where the sun's heat might melt the wax that held them together. A steady, careful middle path, he said, was the only safe way to cross the sea to freedom. They rose together from the tower and flew out over the water, and for a while all went well. But Icarus, exhilarated by the freedom of flight, by the vast open sky where he had only ever known stone walls, forgot his father's quiet caution and rose higher and higher still, chasing the sun's warmth without noticing how close he had drifted toward it. The wax, as his father had warned, began to soften, then melt entirely, and the feathers came loose one by one, drifting down toward the sea like slow, pale snow, until Icarus himself fell gently and terribly into the waves below. Daedalus, looking back and finding only feathers scattered across the water where his son had been, grieved in a way no craftsman's skill could ever repair. It is a small story, but an old and enduring one, carried forward mostly for its quiet reminder. A steady middle path, neither too cautious nor too reckless, is very often the safest way through any long crossing. A reminder, perhaps, even for a night as long as this one. There is one more sea voyage worth telling tonight, slow and long, the way a sea journey should be told. A young man named Jason, rightful heir to a stolen throne, was sent by his usurping uncle on a journey believed impossible to survive, to sail to the distant edge of the known world and bring back the golden fleece, the wool of a magical ram, said to hang guarded in a grove watched over by a dragon that never slept. Jason gathered around him some of the greatest heroes of that age, sailors and warriors, and, in some tellings, even Heracles himself for a portion of the journey. And together they built a ship called the Argo, and set out across a long, long stretch of sea. Their journey took them past many strange shores. They passed the clashing rocks, two great stone cliffs said to slam together and crush any ship that tried to pass between them, timing their crossing carefully, the way you might time a single careful breath. They encountered harpies and sirens and storms and long stretches of quiet, uneventful sailing in between, because even the greatest adventures, if you look closely, are mostly made up of quiet, uneventful stretches, small moments of waiting between the larger ones. At last they reached the distant kingdom where the fleece was kept. And there Jason met Medea, a princess with a gift for magic, who, much like Ariadne before her, found herself moved to help the brave stranger who had arrived at her shore. With her guidance and her careful spells, Jason was able to calm the sleepless dragon long enough to take the fleece from its branch, and together they fled back across the sea toward home. I will let this story rest here, gently, at its brightest point, the ship turning for home, the fleece finally won, the long sea behind them glowing faintly gold under a quiet moon. Some old stories continue further into harder chapters for Jason and Medea both. But tonight, let's leave them here, sailing calmly home beneath a wide and settled sky. There are a few more quiet stories worth gathering here before we turn toward Troy, small and old, and worth telling slowly, the way loose threads are worth gathering before a long piece of weaving is finally set down. One begins on a warm shore, where a Phoenician princess named Europa was gathering flowers with her companions near the edge of the sea. Zeus, catching sight of her, took the gentle form of a white bull, so calm and beautiful that Europa, unafraid, wandered close enough to garland its horns with flowers, and, in time, to climb upon its broad, patient back. The bull waded slowly into the water, and one, without warning, carried her far out across the sea, all the way to the shores of a distant island called Crete, where Zeus revealed his true self at last. Europa remained there, and in time, the land across which she had travelled, and much of the wider region beyond it, came to be called by her name, Europe, a name still carried today by an entire stretch of the world, born from one long, quiet ride across a calm and ancient sea. Europa's brother, a prince named Cadmus, was sent out by his grieving father to search for her, with strict instructions not to return until he had found her. He never did find his sister, but his search carried him across long stretches of unfamiliar land, until at last, weary and uncertain, he consulted an oracle who told him to stop following his sister's trail entirely, and instead to follow a particular cow he would soon encounter, and to build a city on the exact spot where the cow finally lay down to rest. Cadmus did as he was told, and where the cow finally settled, he founded a great city that would come to be called Thebes. Before he could build it, though, he needed to fetch water from a nearby spring, guarded, as it happened, by a fierce dragon. Cadmus fought and killed the creature, and on the strange advice of the goddess Athena, sowed its sharp teeth into the freshly turned earth nearby. From those planted teeth, armed warriors sprang up fully grown from the soil itself, fighting each other almost immediately upon rising, until only 5 remained, and these 5, calming at last, became the first noble families of the new city, so that Thebes, in its own strange and violent way, grew literally from the ground on which it stood. There is a gentler tale that follows, about a young man named Bellerophon, who was given, by the favour of the gods, a magnificent winged horse, Pegasus himself, the very horse born long ago from Medusa's fall, tamed at last with a golden bridle gifted by Athena in a dream. Riding high above the earth on Pegasus's broad white wings, Bellerophon was sent to face the Chimera, a monstrous creature with the front of a lion, the body of a goat, and the tail of a serpent, breathing fire from a mouth that could not be safely approached on foot. From high above, out of reach of its flames, Bellerophon was able to strike the creature down, succeeding at a task that had seemed from the ground entirely impossible. There is a story, too, about a swift-footed young woman named Atalanta who could outrun any man in the land, and who had declared quite firmly that she would marry only a suitor who could beat her in a foot race, with the understanding, sobering to most who considered it, that any suitor who lost would forfeit his life. Many tried, and many lost. At last, a clever young man named Epaminondas, aided by Aphrodite, was given 3 golden apples, and as he raced beside Atalanta, he rolled them one at a time, just off to the side of her path. Atalanta, curious despite herself, paused each time to gather the beautiful fruit, and in those small repeated pauses, Hippomenes was finally able to win the race, and, in time, her genuine affection alongside it. And there is a quieter, gentler story still about a sculptor named Pygmalion, who found himself unable to love any of the women around him, and who instead carved with great care and patience a woman of ivory so lifelike and so beautiful that he found himself falling in love with his own creation. Moved by the sincerity of his devotion, Aphrodite breathed life into the statue, and she stepped down from her pedestal as a living woman, and the two were married. A small reminder that even the quietest, most solitary devotion can sometimes be answered gently when it is genuine. One last stop before Troy. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus stood Delphi, a quiet mountain sanctuary sacred to Apollo, said to sit directly above the very center of the world. Long before Apollo claimed it, the site had been guarded by a great serpent called Python, and Apollo, still young, faced and defeated the creature there, claiming the sanctuary as his own ever after. From that day on, a priestess known as the Pythia would sit above a certain hidden cleft in the rock, breathing in whatever quiet vapors rose from the earth below, and speak, in a voice not entirely her own, the answers that kings and travelers had climbed the mountain to receive. For centuries afterward, no important decision in the ancient world was made without a quiet journey up that mountain first, to sit, to ask, and to listen. There is a small, warm story worth telling here too, about an old couple named Philemon and Baucis, who lived a simple, humble life in a small cottage on a hillside. One evening, 2 weary travelers came through their village asking for shelter and were turned away at every door, except this last one. Philemon and Baucis, though they had little to offer, welcomed the strangers in gladly, sharing what modest food and wine they had, refilling the travelers' cups again and again from a jug that never seemed to empty, though neither of them thought much of it at the time. The travelers, it turned out, were Zeus and Hermes, quietly testing the hospitality of the region after growing weary of so many closed doors. Revealing themselves at last, they led the old couple safely up a nearby hill, just before a great flood swept through the valley below, washing away every home that had turned them away, sparing only the small, humble cottage that had welcomed them. In gratitude, the couple asked for only one thing, that they might never be separated, even in death. Years later, when their time finally came, they were transformed together into two trees growing from a single trunk, standing side by side on that same quiet hillside, their branches forever intertwined. There is a sadder story, briefer, about two young lovers named Pyramus and Thisbe, who lived in neighboring houses, separated by a single wall, forbidden by their families to marry. They would whisper to each other through a small crack in that wall each night, and at last arranged to meet secretly beneath a white mulberry tree outside the city walls. Thisbe arrived first, but was frightened away by a lioness with blood on its jaws from a recent kill, dropping her veil as she fled to hide. Pyramus, arriving moments later and finding the torn, bloodied veil, believed the worst had happened, and in his grief ended his own life beneath the tree. Thisbe, returning cautiously once the lioness had gone, found him there and could not bear to go on without him. The mulberries on that tree, the old story tells us, had been white before that night and turned a deep, permanent red afterward, stained, the poets say, by the grief of two lovers who simply could not find their way to each other in time. There is a gentler grief that belongs here too, about a beautiful young man named Hyacinthus, deeply loved by Apollo, who spent long, warm afternoons with him practicing the discus throw on open, sunlit fields. During one such afternoon, a discus thrown by Apollo struck the ground and rebounded unexpectedly, striking Hyacinthus and ending his life in a single terrible accident. Apollo's grief was immense, and rather than let his companions simply vanish from the world, he caused a new flower to spring up from the blood-soaked ground where Hyacinthus had fallen. A deep, rich, purple-red flower that still carries his name today, blooming each spring as a quiet, lasting memorial to a friendship the sun god could not bear to fully lose. There is a quieter story worth resting on next, about a king named Midas, who once did a small kindness for a wandering satyr and was offered, in return, a single wish by the god Dionysus. Midas, dazzled by the thought of wealth beyond counting, wished that everything he touched might turn to gold. Dionysus, sensing perhaps that the wish carried more weight than the king had considered, granted it anyway, gently, the way a lesson is sometimes granted disguised as a gift. At first, Midas was delighted. A twig became gold in his hand, a stone, the doorframe of his own palace. He walked through his halls, turning ordinary things to treasure with every careless touch, laughing at his sudden fortune. But when supper was set before him, and the food itself turned to hard, cold gold the moment his fingers brushed it, his delight began to falter. And when his own small daughter ran to embrace him and became, in that same terrible instant, a still and golden statue in his arms, Midas understood, all at once, and far too late, the true weight of what he had asked for. Grieving and desperate, he returned to Dionysus and begged to have the gift undone, and the god, moved by genuine remorse rather than mere regret, told him to wash in the waters of a nearby river, which would carry the golden touch away downstream. Midas did so, and the gift left him, and his daughter and his supper were both restored to what they had been before. It is an old story, but a useful one to carry quietly into sleep tonight, that the things we sometimes wish for most urgently are not always the things that would serve us best, and that the ordinary, unremarkable people and moments already around us are very often worth more than any amount of gold. There is one more quiet story about Apollo worth telling before we turn toward Troy, gentler in its sorrow than most, about a river nymph named Daphne. Apollo, struck by Eros's arrow of love, became devoted to her completely, pursuing her through the forest with a warmth she did not return. For Daphne, struck instead by Eros's other arrow, the one that repels rather than draws, wanted nothing but to be left to her quiet, solitary life among the trees and streams. As Apollo drew close behind her one afternoon, Daphne cried out to her father, a river god, to save her by any means necessary. And in that moment, her feet took root into the earth, her skin roughened into bark, her arms lifted and spread into branches and leaves. She became, in an instant, a laurel tree, forever rooted, forever just beyond his reach. Apollo, grieving but gentle even in his sorrow, embraced the tree she had become and declared the laurel forever sacred to him. Its leaves woven ever after into the crowns of poets, athletes, and victors, a quiet honor carried forward from a pursuit that was never quite meant to end the way he had hoped. There is a harder story that belongs here too, about a proud queen named Niobe, blessed with 14 children, 7 sons, and 7 daughters, who boasted once too loudly that she was greater than the goddess Leto, who had borne only 2 children of her own, Apollo and Artemis. Leto's twins, hearing this boast, were not inclined to let it pass. Apollo, with his arrows, ended the lives of Niobe's sons, and Artemis, with hers, ended the lives of her daughters, until the proud queen was left with nothing at all, only grief so total and so heavy that she could no longer move, no longer speak, no longer do anything but weep. In time, the old story tells us, she was transformed into stone, a tall, weeping rock formation on a distant mountainside, said to still show the faint trace of tears running endlessly down its face even now. A quiet, sobering reminder that pride spoken too loudly can sometimes cost far more than it seems worth at the time. And there is a smaller, stranger story about a young hunter named Actaeon, who, wandering through the woods one warm afternoon, stumbled by pure accident upon Artemis herself, bathing in a hidden forest pool with her companions. Artemis, fiercely protective of her privacy and unwilling to let a mortal carry the memory of what he had seen, transformed him instantly into a stag. His own hunting hounds, no longer recognizing their master beneath the antlers and fur, gave chase and brought him down in the same forest where he had once hunted freely himself. It is a hard little story, softened only by its brevity and by the quiet reminder tucked inside it, that even an innocent, accidental glimpse into something not meant for us can sometimes carry consequences larger than we intended. Let's turn now toward the story that the old poets return to more often than almost any other, the story of Troy. And, like any long journey, it begins small, almost too small to notice. At a wedding among the gods, the marriage of a mortal king to a sea nymph, every god and goddess was invited, except one, Eris, goddess of discord, whose presence, understandably, tended to unsettle any gathering. Uninvited and unbothered by convention, she came anyway, and tossed among the guests a single golden apple inscribed with the words, "For the fairest." 3 goddesses immediately claimed it: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom; and Aphrodite, goddess of love. Rather than settle the matter themselves, they brought the question to a young Trojan prince named Paris, tending his flocks quietly on a hillside, unaware that his choice would echo for a decade to come. Each goddess, wanting his favor, offered him something. Hera offered power over great kingdoms, Athena offered wisdom and skill in war, and Aphrodite offered him the love of the most beautiful mortal woman in the world. Paris, young and perhaps thinking more of his own heart than of kingdoms or wisdom, chose Aphrodite's gift. The trouble was this: the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, was already married to a Greek king named Menelaus. With Aphrodite's quiet guidance, Paris travelled to Greece, and Helen, whether by choice or by the pull of the goddess's influence. The old stories differ gently on this point, and we needn't decide it tonight. Left with him for Troy. Menelaus, understandably grieved and angered, called upon his brother Agamemnon, and together they gathered the great kings and warriors of Greece, bound by old oaths of loyalty, to sail across the sea and bring Helen home. And so, from one small uninvited guest and one golden apple, 1,000 ships eventually set sail. Rest for a moment here, if you'd like. The greatest wars in these old stories, it seems, so often begin with something very small. A single unkind gesture, a single hasty choice. The way even the largest storm begins, as nothing more than a small stirring of warm air over a distant, quiet sea. Before the ships could even set sail, there was one more difficult chapter, quiet and sorrowful, that belongs here. The Greek fleet, gathered and ready at a harbour called Aulis, found itself becalmed, day after day, with no wind at all to carry the sails forward. A prophet revealed that Agamemnon had unknowingly offended Artemis, and that only one thing would satisfy her and bring the winds back: the sacrifice of his own daughter, Iphigenia. It is one of the harder moments in this long story, and different old poets softened it in different ways. In some tellings, Artemis, at the very last moment, took pity and swept the girl away to safety, leaving a deer in her place upon the altar, carrying Iphigenia instead to a distant temple, where she would serve as a priestess for years to come. We will let that gentler version rest here tonight, and let the winds, however they came, finally fill the waiting sails. There is one more figure worth knowing before the war itself begins: a Trojan princess named Cassandra, daughter of King Priam, who had once been granted the gift of true prophecy by Apollo himself, moved by his fondness for her. But when Cassandra did not return his affection the way he had hoped, Apollo, unable to take back a gift once given, added to it a bitter twist. She would always see the truth clearly, and she would never, ever be believed. Throughout the long years of the war, Cassandra foresaw its outcome again and again: the wooden horse, the fall of the city, the fate of her own family. And each time she was dismissed as troubled or ignored entirely, watching helplessly as everything she predicted unfolded exactly as she had seen it. It is a quiet, aching kind of story, and it has lent its shape to a phrase still used today, whenever someone's true warnings go unheeded, simply because they were the one giving them. The war at Troy lasted 10 long years, and there is far more to it than any single quiet telling could hold. Tonight, let's move through it slowly and gently, touching only its softest and most memorable moments, the way moonlight touches only the highest points of a landscape rather than illuminating every hidden corner. The Greek forces gathered on the shore beneath Troy's tall walls, led by Agamemnon, and among them stood Achilles, greatest warrior of his generation, whose mother, the sea nymph Thetis, had once dipped him as an infant into the river Styx to make him invulnerable, holding him by the heel, the one small place the water never touched. For years, the two sides fought and paused and fought again, a long, grinding rhythm of battle and stillness, the tide of the war rising and falling like a very slow sea. A quarrel arose between Agamemnon and Achilles over a matter of pride, and Achilles, deeply wounded by the insult, withdrew from the fighting altogether, refusing to lift his sword no matter how the battle turned against his fellow Greeks. Many of them fell in the difficult days that followed. At last, Achilles' closest companion, Patroclus, unable to bear watching his friends suffer any longer, borrowed Achilles' armor and entered the battle in his place, hoping his mere appearance might frighten the Trojans back. It worked for a time, until Hector, greatest warrior of Troy and its prince, met him in battle and, not realizing who truly wore the armor, ended his life. Achilles' grief when he learned what had happened was enormous and terrible, and it drew him back into the war at last, not for pride this time, but for sorrow. He met Hector before the walls of Troy, and in a battle that the old poets lingered over more than almost any other, Achilles avenged his friend. Even now, the story does not turn cruel for long. Hector's father, King Priam, came that same night, alone and unguarded, to Achilles' tent to beg for his son's body so that it might be properly honored and laid to rest. And Achilles, still deep in his own grief, found something like tenderness in himself for the old king's sorrow, and returned Hector's body gently, allowing Troy the time it needed to mourn. There is something worth resting on in that quiet moment. Two men on opposite sides of a terrible war sitting together for one evening, simply grieving together as fathers and as friends before the fighting resumed. Achilles himself did not survive much longer after this. In most tellings, an arrow, guided by Paris and some say by Apollo's hand, found the single unprotected place on his whole body. That same heel his mother had once held him by, the one small part the river had never touched. And the greatest warrior of the war fell in the same dust as so many others he had once fought beside. The war continued a while longer, until finally the Greeks devised a clever trick. A great wooden horse, built as a supposed gift, hollow inside and filled with hidden soldiers. The Trojans, believing the war finally over, brought the horse within their own walls. And that night, the hidden soldiers slipped out and opened the gates to the waiting Greek army beyond. Troy fell that night after 10 long years, and the war that had begun with a single golden apple came finally, quietly, to its end. Not everyone within the burning city was lost that night. A Trojan prince named Aeneas, carrying his elderly father on his own back and leading his young son by the hand, made his way out through the chaos and flame, and, in the tellings that later grew up around him, sailed on across the sea to found, eventually, a new people in a distant land. A quiet reminder that even from the ashes of the greatest fall, something new can still find its way to being built. Let the heaviness of this chapter pass through you gently, the way it should. There is grief in this story, yes, but also endurance, and even, here and there, unexpected tenderness between enemies. That, too, is part of what these old stories were always trying to teach. Among the Greeks who fought at Troy was a clever king named Odysseus, whose journey home afterward became, in time, its own long and winding story. It should have taken him only a matter of weeks to sail back to his island kingdom of Ithaca, where his wife Penelope and his young son waited for him. Instead, it took him 10 more years, wandering across a wide, restless sea, delayed again and again by storms, by strange islands, by the anger of a god he had unknowingly offended. We will move through his wanderings slowly, the way sleep itself moves, drifting from one soft, half-formed scene to the next, without needing to hold too tightly to any of them. He and his crew came first to the land of the lotus eaters, where a strange fruit made anyone who tasted it forget entirely their wish to go home, content simply to drift in a warm, dreamy haze forever. Odysseus, sensing the danger of a peace too complete to leave, gathered his sailors back to their ship and pressed onward. They came next to the island of the Cyclops Polyphemus, a giant with a single eye who trapped them in his cave and might have ended them all, had Odysseus not devised a clever escape, blinding the giant while he slept, and slipping away, hidden beneath the bellies of the giant's own sheep as they were let out to graze. But in his pride, Odysseus called out his true name as they sailed away, and Polyphemus, in his pain and fury, called upon his father Poseidon to curse Odysseus's journey home. It is this curse, more than any other single thing, that lengthened his voyage into the long, wandering ordeal it became. They passed the island of Aiolos, keeper of the winds, who gave Odysseus a bag containing every wind except the one that would carry them home. A bag his own curious crew, believing it held hidden treasure, opened while Odysseus slept, scattering them all backward across the sea they had only just crossed. They encountered Circe, a sorceress who turned Odysseus's men briefly into swine, before Odysseus, aided by the god Hermes, was able to free them and, in time, find safe rest and hospitality on her island for the better part of a year. Circe, in time, grew genuinely fond of Odysseus, and it was on her quiet advice that he undertook one of the strangest parts of his whole journey, a visit to the edge of the underworld itself, to seek counsel from the spirit of a blind prophet who could tell him, more clearly than any living voice, exactly what still lay ahead on his long road home. They passed the sirens, whose songs were said to lure sailors to their deaths on hidden rocks. Odysseus had his crew fill their ears with wax, while he himself, wanting to hear the song without succumbing to it, had them bind him tightly to the mast, so that no matter how the music called to him, he could not follow it. They passed between Scylla, a 6-headed monster fixed high on a cliff, and Charybdis, a great whirlpool below, an old phrase still used today for being caught between two dangers with no safe path between them. They came, in time, to an island sacred to the sun god Helios, where sleek golden cattle grazed peacefully under his watchful eye, and Odysseus, knowing the danger, warned his remaining crew firmly not to touch a single one of them, no matter how great their hunger grew. But a storm trapped them there for many long days, their food supplies dwindling, and at last, while Odysseus slept, his desperate crew broke their promise and slaughtered several of the cattle for a meal. Helios, furious at the offense, demanded justice from Zeus, and when the ship finally sailed on, a great storm rose up and destroyed it entirely, taking every last one of Odysseus's remaining companions with it, leaving him at last entirely alone upon the sea, clinging to a single broken plank of his own shattered ship. At last, having lost every one of his companions along the way through one hardship or another, Odysseus washed ashore, alone on the island of the nymph Calypso, who kept him there, gently but firmly, for 7 long years, until finally the gods intervened and allowed him to continue home. When he finally reached Ithaca, he found his own halls filled with suitors who had spent years pressuring his wife Penelope to remarry, believing him long dead. Penelope, patient and clever in her own right, had kept them at bay for years with a clever trick of her own, weaving a burial shroud by day and quietly unweaving it each night, claiming she would choose a new husband only once the shroud was complete. Odysseus, disguised as a humble beggar, returned to his own home unrecognized, quietly observing the suitors who had made themselves comfortable in his halls, eating his food and courting his wife as though he would never return. Penelope, still clever, still patient, announced at last that she would marry whichever suitor could string her husband's great hunting bow and shoot an arrow cleanly through a row of 12 axe heads, a feat no ordinary man could manage. One suitor after another tried and failed, unable even to bend the bow enough to string it. Then the disguised beggar asked quietly if he might try, and amid the suitor's mocking laughter, he took the bow into his own familiar hands, strung it with an ease that startled the room into silence, and sent the arrow clean through all 12 axe heads in a single motion. Only then did he cast aside his disguise, and with his son at his side, brought a long, difficult reckoning to the suitors who had disrespected his home for so many years. And in time, and in his own gentle, careful way, he revealed himself fully to Penelope too, who tested his identity once more with a small private detail only her true husband could have known, and, satisfied at last, welcomed him home. In time, reclaiming his household and his family at long, long last, the long war and the longer voyage both finally came to their quiet close. 20 years altogether since he had first left for Troy, 10 years of war and 10 more of wandering, before he finally sat once more at his own table, beside his own wife, in his own quiet home. If you have been on any long journey yourself, of any kind, let this be a gentle reminder tonight. Home is still there, waiting patiently, even when the way back seems impossibly long. We spoke earlier of Hades and of the quiet realm he ruled below the earth. Let's return there now, gently, as our story begins to settle toward its own ending. The underworld, in the old telling, was not a place of punishment for everyone who arrived there. That idea came later, softened and shaped by other cultures over many centuries. In the oldest Greek telling, it was simply where all mortals went, good and difficult alike, a vast, dim, quiet realm beneath the world, ruled fairly by Hades and his queen Persephone. To reach it, a soul had to cross the river Styx, ferried across by an old boatman named Charon, who required a small coin placed by loving hands upon the eyes of the dead as payment for the crossing. At the far gate stood Cerberus, the three-headed hound we met briefly during Heracles' final labour, allowing all souls to enter, but never, ever letting any leave. Within, the underworld held several regions. The fields of asphodel, wide and grey and quiet, where most ordinary souls wandered gently, without great joy or great suffering, simply resting. Elysium, for the truly heroic and virtuous. A bright, peaceful meadow, warm and soft, where the greatest souls found lasting rest. And Tartarus, that same deep chasm we spoke of in our very first chapter, reserved for the very few whose deeds in life had been truly, deeply wrong. A small handful of stories are remembered from that deepest region, and we can pass through them softly, the way you might glance briefly into a dim room without stepping fully inside. There was Sisyphus, a clever, prideful king who had twice managed to cheat death itself through trickery, and who was given, as his lasting task, a great boulder to push up a steep hill, only to watch it roll back down again each time he neared the top. An endless, patient labour with no final rest. And there was Tantalus, who had once betrayed the trust of the gods, and who stood forever in a pool of clear water beneath branches heavy with fruit, both always just out of reach whenever he leaned toward them. We won't linger long in Tartarus tonight. Even old stories know when to look away and return to gentler rooms. There were rivers too, each with its own quiet character. The Styx, river of oaths, upon which even the gods swore their most binding promises. The Lethe, river of forgetting, whose waters, if tasted, washed away memory itself, gently, completely. And the Acheron, river of sorrow, slow and dark. I mention the Lethe now at this point in our story because there is something worth borrowing from it tonight. If any small worry from your day is still clinging to the edges of your mind, imagine it drifting gently toward that quiet river. Let it dissolve there, slowly, the way a single drop of ink dissolves into a much larger body of still water. You do not need to carry it any further tonight. The underworld was not cruel in this oldest telling. It was simply quiet and patient and endlessly restful, much like the place your own mind might be settling toward right now. As our story draws toward its close tonight, let's rise back up, slowly, out of the quiet halls below, back up through the wide, patient earth, back up toward that high, cloud-wrapped mountain where we began. Many of the figures in tonight's story, the old poets tell us, did not simply vanish when their part in the story ended. Some were placed among the stars, transformed gently into constellations, so that their stories could be read quietly in the night sky, for as long as there were people willing to look up and remember them. Orion, the great hunter, strides now across the winter sky, his belt of 3 bright stars visible on any clear, dark night. The Pleiades, 7 sisters, cluster faintly together nearby, watched over, some say, by his memory. Perseus, whom we followed earlier tonight on his journey to defeat Medusa, holds his place in the autumn sky, not far from Andromeda, whom he rescued, and Cassiopeia, her mother, seated in her chair of stars. even Heracles has his own quiet constellation, kneeling gently among the northern stars, resting perhaps after all those long labours. If you were somewhere tonight where the sky was clear and dark, you could, in theory, look up and find pieces of everything we've spoken of tonight. Heroes and monsters and gods scattered gently across the darkness, still telling their stories silently to anyone patient enough to look. You don't need to go looking tonight, of course. It's enough simply to know they are there, quietly overhead, the way they have been for thousands of years, long before you were born, and long after you will have forgotten most of what was said here tonight. That, I think, is part of what makes these old stories worth returning to, again and again, the way we have tonight. They were never really about gods and monsters at all, not entirely. They were about the things that stay true no matter how old the story gets. That winters end, that light returns, that a thread held patiently can still lead you out of even the darkest maze. That home waits, however long the journey takes to reach it. We have travelled a long way together tonight, from the very first hush of chaos, before there was even a sky to rise into, through the long turning of ages, gods rising and falling and rising again, through heroes and monsters and long, patient journeys home. There is nothing more you need to carry forward from any of it. Let the story settle now, the way Gaia once settled slowly into shape out of the dark, the way Persephone settles each year into her quiet season below, the way Odysseus, after 20 long years, finally settled back into his own soft bed beside people who had waited patiently for his return. Your breathing has likely grown slow by now, if it hasn't already carried you somewhere else entirely. Wherever you are drifting tonight, let it be somewhere gentle, somewhere quiet, somewhere golden, the way that first age of the world was golden, unhurried, at peace. If any part of you is still awake enough to notice your own breathing, let it be slow now, slower than when we began. In, gently, out, more gently still. Somewhere in this story tonight, a stone was mistaken for a sleeping child, and the world went on regardless. Somewhere, a thread led a frightened young man safely out of the dark. Somewhere, a father built wings for his son out of nothing but feathers and care. Somewhere, a woman waited 20 years and never once stopped weaving. None of them rushed. None of them needed to. The story simply carried them, the way it is carrying you now, toward wherever it is you're meant to rest. You do not need to remember chaos, or Cronus, or the 12 long labours, or the 10 long years at Troy, or the 10 more years it took to sail home afterward. You do not need to remember any names at all. Let them all go, gently, the way Persephone lets go of the world above each autumn, unworried, unafraid, certain of her own quiet return. Sleep well. The stars will keep the rest of the story for you, the way they always have, patient and unhurried, until you're ready to hear it again.